Everyone, welcome to another video in our Unity 3D project where we're creating a first-person shooter. In this video, we're going to talk about our game objects, something called components, something called variables, and how we can access them in our scripts. Now, the first thing we're going to do is try and understand the difference between all those. Here in the hierarchy, you can see some of the objects that we've created. These are all game objects. So everything here in our world, that's a game object, including the lights, cameras, terrain, just normal 3D models, and things like that. Later on, so in our next video, we're going to be creating empty game objects. So objects we won't even see, but will exist in our game space. Here in the inspector, which is this area on this side, we have something called components, which are each of these. So all the things that you can minimize, those are components. So for example, we have a mesh renderer, sphere, collider, sphere, transform, etc. And we're also able to add components with the add component option down here. And we're going to be looking at what some of these components are. Now, when we start creating scripts, which will be in this video as well, scripts are also just components. So we'll come down here and add components, and we'll find our scripts in here. Before we can do anything in our game, we have to learn how we can access all these game objects. So for example, if I pick up some ammo, how will it add to my player's ammo count? Or in our inspector, how can I manipulate these transform elements to move something? So if I'm shooting a bullet, for example, which is what we're going to be doing next video, I want to be able to change its position so that it can move forward. Right, so how do I access this transform component? Now, before we can start that, we're going to create a script. And you can create scripts by going into your scripts folder, right-clicking, going up to create, and then clicking on C# script. Now, before you hit enter, which is something, a common mistake people do, you have to give this a name, and I'll explain why soon. It has to start with a capital letter, and it can only be one word. So this one is going to get our gun shooting in the next video. So I'm just going to call it gun shooting. That's our gun shooting script. Next, we want to attach that to our first person shooter controller, which is up here. And we can do that by grabbing it and just dragging it onto first person shooting controller. We can also grab it and drag it here into the inspector. I'll remove it there again. Or like I said before, we can come down to add component and then search the name. So our name was called gun shooting, and you can see there gun shooting. And you can see that it's been successfully added because I'm just going to minimize some of these components because it comes up as a component inside our FPS controller. Now, I'm going to double click to open this up. And for me, it's going to open here in Visual Studio. If you don't have Visual Studio, I recommend downloading it. You can get the free community edition. And it's just a nicer experience to work with. Now, if you don't have Visual Studio, it will most likely open up in something called MonoDevelop. MonoDevelop is completely fine for coding, it just doesn't have some of the features that come in handy in Visual Studio. Okay, so if you didn't have Visual Studio and you've just downloaded it and installed the file, you can come up here to edit inside your Unity program, and you want to look down into preferences, and down here in external tools, you can choose your external script editor. So if I click on this, it says mono developed, which comes built in. So that comes standard with Unity, or I chose Visual Studio 2017. I'll go back to my gun shooting script. And I'll show you the quickest way of accessing some of those game objects and components. Now, when you open up your script, you have a couple things that have been put into your script by default. Up here, you have a few things that say using and then a name. These are called namespaces. And namespaces are just a whole collection of classes. And you'll understand more of what classes are as we go. But whenever you create a script, Unity creates what's called a class, also with the same name. So we called our script gun shooting, so the class it created was also called gun shooting. Now this bit just means it's grabbing, or it's called inheritance, which means it's inheriting some code from this class called monoBehavior. That's a little bit advanced right now for beginners, so we'll just ignore that for now. Just know that you've created a class, and inside of the class you have these two things that are called functions. And functions are just a block of code that you can call whenever you want. Now one's called start, and inside the start you're going to put in some code that gets run whenever that object comes into existence. Now that's a bit of a simplistic definition, but it's good enough for now. So say I'm shooting a bullet, the start code in the bullet will run as soon as I spawn the bullet. Then you have your update block, and everything in your update gets run once a frame. So the number of frames per second that your game will get will be dependent on how long the code in your update is taking to run. And a few other things. Right. So let's make some space up here. Let's say that I'm going to use one of these spare bullets that I created. Let's say I want to access the position of that bullet. So I look here into position and I can see that it is part of the transform component right over there. Right, and that's the position. And the position has three values, a X, a Y, and a Z. Now, how do I access that? Well, the first thing I'm going to have to do is access this whole transform component. And I can do that by going back into my script. And right at the top, but still inside the class, I'm going to zoom in here. Right at the top, but still inside the class, I'm going to type in transform, which is referring to that transform component. And I'm going to have to give it a name. So it has to start with a letter, and it can only have letters, numbers, and underscrolls. So this, usually you want the name to refer to what that object is. Right, so this is the bullets transform, so I'm going to call it bullet transform, like so. It has to all be one word, it can't be two separate words. And then I'm going to put a semicolon at the end. The semicolon just closes what's called a statement in coding. So this is a statement, and a statement is kind of like a sentence, and a semicolon is kind of like a full stop. So when your computer runs the code, it's going to read this line, and it's going to continue reading until it sees the semicolon, and then it's going to stop and execute all the code it ran before it. And you can add statements under here. This obviously isn't a real statement, it's just an example. Right, so it'll read this, see the semicolon, execute that code. Then move on to the next line, read this, see the semicolon, execute that code, and then so on and so forth. So those weren't real lines of code, so I'll delete it. Okay. When you create something like this, all I've done was created an empty transform called bullet transform. And this bullet transform is not referring to anything else at the moment. but we want it to refer to these values. So there's two ways to do that. One is we can come into our start and we can assign it a value manually. Now this way is a little complicated for now, so I'm going to leave that out, but we'll definitely get to it. Or another way is you can change what's called the access specifier. Now the access specifier can, for a beginner, will only really refer to one of two words, either public or something called private. Now by default, if you don't say public or private, it's going to be private. What does that mean? It just means that whatever you create, this object, so you created an empty transform object, if it was private, you wouldn't be able to access it from outside this class. But because we've made it public, we can access it from outside this class. Now, because I've made that public, if I go now back to Unity, and I find where I attach that script to, so I attach it to FPS Controller and scroll down, it's asking me, what do I want my bullet transform to be? And then at the moment, it says none, followed by the word transform in brackets. Now, all that is saying, in here, you have an empty transform object, that's why that's in brackets, called bullet transform. What do you want to assign to it? And all you have to do to assign a transform to it is drag in the transform you want. So if I just drag in bullet test 1, which is an object up in my hierarchy, I can drag that in, and now its transform is stored in there. So anything now, if I come back here, anything that I do to bullet transform inside my start or update functions, or even other functions that I create, will now do it to this bullet test 1, because I've explicitly told my script that's attached to FPS Controller that I want its bullet transform object to refer to that bullet test 1's transform. Now, what if I wanted the transform from my own script? If I wanted the transform from my own script, from my own game object, I could click on it and just drag it in there, just like so. Right, so if I drag in a different game object to the one that my script's attached to, it's just going to store its transform in. Or if I drag in just the transform from my current game object, it'll store that. And then I can manipulate values with that. Now, what if I didn't just want the transform, but I wanted the entire game object? So say I wanted this whole bullet. Well, to change that, instead of the word transform, I'll just type in, oops, the code's being run at the moment. I'll just type in game object bullet transform, and then I can take away the transform word. That's still a statement. So same as before, now we're saying I want something public, so I want other classes to be able to access this game object. I'm going to be storing a game object in it, and I'm calling it bullet. So this word can be anything you want. It's just a word I invented, and it's referring to that bullet sphere I created from the last video. Now when I go back and I look in that gun shooting script, so I'm just going to minimize some of this. But if I look in that gun shooting script, it's saying bullet, and currently it's none, and now it's telling me that it wants a game object in there. And I can now just click on that bullet and drag it in. So anything I now do to this bullet object in my script is going to refer to whatever I attach in here, which is bullet test 1, which is this bullet test 1. Excellent. Now, one other thing you have to know is the concept of a variable. And a variable is just like a box that will store some type of information. So for example, I'm just going to delete this bullet one actually. For example, you might want to have a value for your health. Right, so to create this value for your health, I have to type in what's called the data type. Now, there's a fair few data types, but the ones you're going to be using are generally going to be ints. And int is just short for integer, which means a whole number. So a non-decimal point number. It can be positive or negative. So I type in int health. Health is just a word I made up. It could have been anything, like for example, damage. Right? And then I can set it to whatever value I want by typing the equal sign and then just typing in an integer value, say 34. So all I'm doing in this line of code is when the computer tries reading this, it's going to come in and see this equal sign. Then it's going to take whatever's on the right and store it into whatever's on the left, as long as it matches that data type. Right, so that's an int. You also have a data type called a float. So for example, float, I'll make this one health, is 100F. So if it's a float number, you have to put 100F. And a float is just a decimal number type. So it could be like 1.3 or negative 127.6 or something like that. If it has a point, that means it's a float. These are the two most common, plus something called a string, which is just text. So you can't do any additions or subtractions or anything like that with the text. But say I give it a name, so actually let's call it player name, equals, and then a string always starts with quotation marks. You'll have an open and close quotation marks, and you can put in whatever name you want and close it off. So a string is just letters. Now, if we have a look at FPS Controller, which is where our script is attached to, it's removed that last line of code we had for the game object, and it's currently back to its default, where it just says script. Now, if I come back into these, I can now put in public in front of them. So say I put public in front of the damage and in front of the player name and save those. Now I'll come back to Unity and wait for it to compile, and then it's come up damage and player name. And this allows us to test our code just by allowing us to change our values in here. So if I want my damage to be 12 instead, I can just type in 12 there. And our damage will now be 12. So whatever you type into here will take precedence over whatever you type into here. Now, why are variables important? Variables are important because it allows us to quickly change values, and it also allows us to prevent mistakes. So for example, say I have in my update a whole bunch of code. So say I have like 50 lines of code, right? And some of them use damage in multiple ways. For example, say you level up and you increase your damage. By 1. Or say you attack the enemy and decrease the enemy's life, health, by the amount of damage. You see where I'm going with this? But say you used it like, I don't know, 10 times, right? I could have, instead of using the word damage in these lines of code, just referred to an explicit number. So I could have just said 34. So increase 34 by 1 or decrease enemy's health by 34. However, if I did that and then I changed my mind, so say I wanted to change my damage now to 38, I'd have to go back into my code, look for everywhere where I wrote 34 and change it to 38, which makes it prone to errors because I might miss one and also wastes a lot of my time looking for those numbers. Right? Whereas say I wanted to change damage to 15, I can just come up here once, change it to 15, and everywhere else in my code that I've written damage will now be only worth 15. Okay. I know that's a lot in one video. I just wanted to give a quick introduction to some concepts that we'll be using regularly. Most of that is fairly difficult to comprehend straight up, so we're going to need some practice before we do it. I'm just going to delete all the code we have for now so we can start afresh in the next video. Alright, so that's what your default script should look like. And then in the next video, we'll start getting our gun shooting.